Now, talking about some of what at least they think are their strengths, so many of them talked about how they were great at multitasking, which means doing a lot of things at once. And this first quote I have here came from a young woman at IBM who told me about her day and how she does so many things at once using her cell phone, her computer, and other devices. And it's something that I think starts young. There was a study done by the Kaiser Foundation in the United States that found that a third of young people multitask while doing their homework, sort of what I was talking about with my son. They listen to iPods, they have their cell phones with them, they're texting while they're doing homework. Some people worry that this is the attention deficit disorder generation and that they won't be able to focus on a really complex, challenging problem when they have to, that they'll be so distractible that it will be hard for them to really work on one thing at a time. And there are studies that have been done, which I cite in my book, that do question how many things one can do successfully at one time. Now, this is clearly the texting generation and the tweeting generation. I had this brought home to me when I was researching my book very clearly because I'm an email user mostly. But I was trying to interview someone who had been an intern at FedEx, and she had gone back to college, so FedEx gave me her email address. So I sent off an interview request to her, and I didn't hear back for weeks. So FedEx said, "So did you finally interview our intern?" And I said, "No, she probably was too busy with schoolwork. She didn't answer me." And they said, "Wait, give us a half hour." So a half hour later, I get an email from her. Turns out FedEx found her on Facebook, and she told me, "I just don't check my email anymore. I view it as a dinosaur." So clearly there's a communication gap in the workplace. At Ernst & Young, they actually give out a guide to text message shortcuts to their older employees so they'll understand what young people mean when they text them. Now, the bad part is if this text dialogue gets into formal writing, and according to some professors it is, that they are seeing text shortcuts in some of the papers that they see turned in. And to me, one of the dangers of communicating too much online rather than in person is that you don't develop critical interpersonal skills. And I used to run a survey of corporate recruiters where they rated business schools. And one of the questions we always asked recruiters was, what is the most important attribute you look for in a graduate? And it was always, 7 years straight, interpersonal skills. And yet, I heard so many stories from parents and managers about young people who would text them, even if they were only 10 feet away, rather than speak to them in person. And with my son, he has an iPhone. He hardly ever uses it to talk. He just texts on it constantly. And I think there's something lost when you don't talk to people, when you don't see them in person. You learn to read body language, you learn to listen well, and you can just learn a style of communication that doesn't come through at all when you're doing everything online. Now, as this generation has moved into colleges, I don't know how many professors are in the audience, teachers, but they really don't want the traditional lecture that I grew up with in college. They want more online instruction. They want it to be very interactive and even entertaining. Now, some teachers in America are creating and using videos that they put out on YouTube that are rather entertaining. So schools are trying to deal with this issue of how do we get their attention and keep it and yet teach them substantive information. So IBM has partnered with some universities with what they call serious games. They're actually video games that teach management and information technology skills. I interviewed a professor at a school called Ohio University where he said he actually brings popular movies and music into his management classes and applies it to management lessons. Some schools like INSEAD in France have created sites in Second Life, that sort of virtual world online that they said they thought it could be successful in teaching entrepreneurship because you can create your own economy there. At another French school, HEC Paris, they give everybody a video iPod when they start, and they use it to download lectures. They use it to be taped. They can tape a presentation the student makes and watch it and learn what they did wrong and what they did right. But then there's also the problem of bringing all this technology into the classroom, that students may be doing things like texting and surfing the net rather than paying attention. And this has led to some actual codes of conduct being developed at universities in America to try to control this. And I was just at a university in Colorado a few weeks ago, and they said that they had to develop one of these codes of conduct because students weren't behaving properly in class. And I'm going to read you a little bit from that code. They said that students should exhibit respectful behavior in classes, including arriving on time, staying until the lecture ends, having the discipline to stay engaged in class, turning off cell phones and pagers, refraining from text messaging, and avoid coming to class wearing clothing that is unduly provocative or has written messages that are rude or obscene. Our students should engage in respectful behavior in all activities because they represent our school. Respectful behavior creates a more desirable, civilized, and productive learning environment, and it models behavior that will be both productive and pleasant when students move from the classroom to the workplace. So I praise that school. I think that's one of the problems, that a lot of young people, what we might consider commonsensical behavior, they don't have it. So they're going to the workplace and they don't always show up on time. They don't always wear the proper clothing. But I think schools and parents too should teach young people what workplace behavior and proper dress is all about. Now, of course, when they move into the workplace, they also expect a lot of technology at their disposal. So more companies are creating internal social networks. I just did an interview a few weeks ago with Intel, and they just created an internal social network that includes wikis and blogs. At Johnson & Johnson, the MBA students actually took it upon themselves to create their own social network because they're spread all over the world, and they wanted to keep in touch with fellow MBAs. Now, some companies are doing digital corporate training, but there still is some resistance to all this technology in the workplace because there's a fear that there will be a loss of company secrets if you let young people get on some of these sites like Facebook, and there's also concern about the technology demands of some of these things like YouTube. So I think the companies that are too resistant will have a very difficult time attracting this generation. In fact, the most successful companies are doing their recruiting in cyberspace. Ernst & Young was one of the very first companies to go on Facebook with a recruiting site. The U.S. Army is on almost every social networking site trying to attract recruits. And KPMG, as far as I know, was the first company that went on YouTube with a recruiting site because they felt it was a way to break through the clutter of other recruiting activities by other companies. So what kind of jobs does this generation want? Well, a lot of them want high-paying jobs, consulting, banking, accounting, maybe partly to pay off their student loans and partly because they want to enjoy their lives and be able to afford nice things. Clearly, at least in America, Google is by far the first choice of almost every student because, again, I think they create this environment where there's a casual work atmosphere and they can do a lot of fun things at work. Nonprofit and government agencies have surprisingly emerged as a major attraction for young people in America. There's a small, I would say it's a smaller group of millennials who want to go out and do it on their own with their own businesses. And I think that's partly because they feel they have control over their lives better if they have their own business. They don't have to answer to anyone, so they can set their own work hours. And finally, this generation wants to work for companies with a good reputation for being socially and environmentally responsible.